My name is Jake McCabe. I am a pre-sales director with LogPoint based in the US. And I'm going to be taking a few minutes this morning or this afternoon to tell you a little bit about LogPoint SIEM and UEBA. And so I will get started. Basically, we're going to run through a few slides, and then we'll jump into a live demo. If you have any questions, I would invite you to please use the Q&A chat panel that comes with Zoom, and I will address those questions as either in between the presentation and the demo, or after the demo. So with that, I will get started. So basically, in order to frame this conversation, first, I just want to take one slide to talk a little bit about the threat landscape. I would assume that this is pretty familiar with most folks on the phone here, but essentially the challenge that we're dealing with is twofold. First, basically, based on data from the Verizon data breach report, we're seeing somewhere on the order of 50% of all breaches are responsible, or are 50% of the breaches are related to organized criminal groups. 28% internal threats and 12% state-affiliated actors. So essentially, what we're dealing here with, the majority of these threats are professional adversaries. Furthermore, there's a gap between the time that it typically takes to detect threats in an environment and the time it takes to actually compromise the system in an environment. So typically, we're talking about most compromises occurring within a few minutes. And most compromises are taking months to detect for organizations. So obviously, the real challenge and the main goal of a security program is to close that gap, and so that you're detecting, you're making it more difficult for adversaries to compromise your environment. So it's taking longer than minutes, and furthermore, you're actually detecting these in a shorter amount of time, ideally within minutes. So this here is essentially the challenge that's presented throughout information security. And the way LogPoint can deal with it is, LogPoint is a SIEM product. So that stands for Security Event and Incident Management. Basically, the goal of a SIEM is to provide very quick detection capabilities within your environment, assuming that it's not possible to always deploy preventive controls within your environment. In some cases, you have to rely on detective controls, and that's where a SIEM can come in. A SIEM is going to take the information that's provided from other security-related tools within your infrastructure, and it's going to bring your attention to those threats which are most worthy of your attention. The challenge being is that you've got a lot of security tools and network devices and such that produce a lot of information that's pertinent to security. However, it's a very large amount of information. So really the goal of a SIEM is to kind of take that large amount of information and present it to users of the SIEM in a manner that's digestible and actionable. So that being said, first I'll just speak a little bit about how LogPoint is deployed. So LogPoint is released as a software appliance. That software appliance contains three functional components, which are collection, storage, and analytics. Each of these, so that the appliance itself, the software appliance, can be delivered and run on bare metal, or it can be run in a hypervisor on premise, such as with VMware or Microsoft Hyper-V, or in the cloud, through AWS or Azure. The three components I mentioned, collection, storage, and analytics, they can exist all in one single logical, virtual appliance, or they can be broken out in order to support things like high availability or distributed architectures. The LogPoint Core SIEM, as I mentioned, the three components: collection, storage, and analytics. The collection component obviously is challenged with getting the security-related information into LogPoint, and basically it does so through a couple different methods. It has the ability. It has collectors, which are basically the ability for LogPoint to receive in typically log data, which is sent to it oftentimes by syslog or other types of logging transports. It also has fetchers. Fetchers are essentially programs on LogPoint that allow LogPoint to reach out to various systems within the environment to pull data off. So an example of a fetcher might be an ODBC connection to a database, or an API call to a cloud-based application. The next process within collection is classification and normalization. So that's the process by which LogPoint can take that data, that log data, which it has ingested, and convert that into something that's that's understandable and structured. And so LogPoint does this using a common taxonomy, which means that all of the various log sources from which LogPoint can take logs can all be translated into a single data structure. And the reason why this is important is because it really streamlines the process of creating analytics from there on, because users of LogPoint do not need to know all the intricacies of the various log sources themselves. For example, one log source may call an IP address a source, SRC, whereas another one may call it a source _ address, for example. Now, both of these represent essentially a source IP address. So LogPoint can map that into one common field called source address. And by the same token, user.name, user _name, they all essentially point to the same thing. So what LogPoint will do up front is translate that information into the same common taxonomy, thereby greatly making easier the process of creating analytics throughout the system. Enrichment is a process by which LogPoint can add additional context to log data, typically from third-party sources. So as an example, if you're taking in a log that references an IP address, it might also be helpful to also record with that log the DNS name of that IP address, or some IP reputation information related to that IP address. So enrichment is the process by which LogPoint can actually reach out to those other data sources, and oftentimes they're things like threat intelligence feeds or LDAP servers, and LogPoint can augment log data with additional enriched data. The routing process within the collection will then route those logs into one of any number of repositories. So LogPoint does allow logs to be stored in multiple repositories. The reason why this is important is because not all logs have the same sensitivities. Some logs may be related to regulated information, such as such as personally identifiable information, for example, and that data may be subject to regulations whereby an organization needs to keep it for a certain amount of time, or an organization needs to make sure that only certain users are able to see that information. So having multiple repositories allows LogPoint to, or allows organizations that use LogPoint to treat different types of data with different sensitivities in a different manner. This also helps with helps organizations to minimize or to maximize the efficiency of their storage costs. So keeping near-term data on high-speed tier 1 disks is great for analytics, and then as logs age out over time and become they become less related to the real-time analytics and more just they're being kept around for compliance purposes. At that point, LogPoint will allow you to tier them off to slower and less expensive storage over time. And finally, the analytics component within LogPoint is really based on LogPoint's very high performance indexing and search engine. So all of LogPoint's analytics, and what I mean by analytics are dashboards, alerts, real-time alerts, and ad hoc queries, as well as reports. These are all different examples of analytics, and they're all based on essentially real-time searches against LogPoint's high-performance search engine, and they're all performed in real time. So why is this approach important? And obviously, I mentioned that a SIEM, the goal of a SIEM is to shorten the amount of time that it takes for an organization to detect some type of breach. And obviously, detection is important. but more so than just detection is situational awareness. So being able to understand not only that a breach occurred, but being able to know what happened, who was involved, and when did it start, how did it happen, what was accessed, and most importantly, how do we respond? So having all this information in a single source of truth is very, very helpful, not only in quick detection, but also quick recovery. LogPoint also has a UEBA product. UEBA stands for User and Entity Behavior Analytics. So the UEBA product augments what is possible with the traditional core SIEM with unsupervised machine learning techniques to model essentially the behavior of users and entities within the system, and then to look for changes in behavior, and to then look at those changes in behavior and see if they're indicative of some type of threat. The reason why UEBA and the machine learning, or I should say the behavioral approach, the reason why it's important is because there are certain types of threats which are very difficult, if not impossible, to detect with traditional rule-based approaches. So being able to take this behavior-based approach allows you to understand whether some event is good or bad when it's not so clear by just looking at the event itself, whether it's good or bad. It requires that you look at other contextual data before and after that event. So as of the most recent LogPoint release, which is 6.74, LogPoint has now mapped all of its alerts to the MITRE ATT&CK framework. And for those who are not familiar with the MITRE ATT&CK framework, MITRE ATT&CK framework is an open source framework that was developed by the MITRE Corporation, which is a not-for-profit organization. And the goal of the attack framework is to document, to provide a knowledge base of all the various techniques, tactics, and procedures that adversaries use when exploiting an enterprise network environment. So it's basically enumerating all of the different ways that an attacker can get in and move throughout your system and steal data. And so what LogPoint has done by mapping its alerts into this framework is it helps you to understand where exactly you have coverage with LogPoint. And moreover, it also helps you to predict potential behavior. So upon finding a particular alert of a particular technique being used, LogPoint, mapping to the framework can then help you to understand who potentially could be attributable to this attack, and also potentially predict what the next step might be in this attack. So, just a couple benefits of this approach. Because of the approach that LogPoint has taken, you now have centralized analysis. So this is very helpful. Rather than having to go to each of your different security tools in your stack, you can actually go to one source, and you have a single pane of glass for monitoring the entire security infrastructure. This approach ultimately results in improved detection. Because you can, you're going to detect things occurring more quickly because you have an inherently correlated view of your environment. And it's also going to help you to speed up your response because you have all that information at your fingertips. You can understand, when something occurred, how it occurred, what are the likely next steps in a typical exploit of this type. And furthermore, the machine learning approach, as I mentioned, this adds another dimension to the detection. So in addition to looking simply for kind of known goods and bads, the UEBA and machine learning approach allows you to look at your environment from the perspective of what are the typical behaviors of my users and entities, and show me when that behavior has changed. And upon finding anomalies in behavior, let's take a look at those anomalies in series and see if they're related to some bigger type of threat. So at this point, I will pause and see if there are any questions in the Q&A, and if not, we'll jump over to the demo. So one question is, how fast is implementation of the appliances? So obviously the answer to this could be highly variable, but at the most basic level, you can stand up an appliance in less than an hour. And in fact, much less than an hour, basically. So we actually We actually distribute LogPoint in various formats, one of which is probably the most common format is as an OVA file, which is essentially a VMware virtual appliance file. So that can be imported directly into VMware. And you can do that in a matter of minutes and spin it up and then add some disk to it and you're off and running. And so with that, with a few steps, you can then configure it to collect log sources. So you can be collecting logs within an hour. And I would say for a full deployment, that depends on the organization. It typically takes anywhere from a few days to get all log sources on board and have all use cases defined to several weeks for more to larger environments. There's another question. So the OVA can be put on AWS deployment. So actually, yes and no. So in the case of an AWS, we actually also distribute an AMI file, which can be shared. Basically, the way that works is we would ask you for your AWS account ID and your deployment region, and then we would actually share it directly to you. Okay, so at this point, I'm going to switch over to the live demo, and please feel free to continue adding questions to the Q&A board, and I will answer them as I see them, and what I don't answer, I will address at the end. So at this point, we're looking at LogPoint's user interface. This is a web-based interface, and it's actually the same interface that one would use whether you're using LogPoint from the perspective of a SOC analyst or if you're using it as an administrator setting up LogPoint. So it's just one single interface. The interface itself is actually divided into 5 logical sections. So we've got dashboard, search, report, incident, and settings. Okay, so right now we're actually looking at the dashboard section. You'll notice that there are a number of dashboard tabs along the top here. So LogPoint allows users to keep as many dashboard tabs as necessary to do their job. Typically a LogPoint user would have probably a few dashboard tabs open related to that person's job function. And dashboards are really good for presenting kind of a bird's eye view of high level information, helping a user to see trends that are occurring within the environment, whether they be spikes in activity or actually potentially lulls in activity, and typically dashboard tabs are organized, like as I mentioned, around job functions. A dashboard tab is comprised of multiple widgets. So each one of these squares is what's known as a widget. A widget essentially is a use case within LogPoint. So it's basically something that you want to do with the SIEM. Each of these widgets is configurable. So you can actually change the position. You can move them around. You can change the size and whatnot. You can actually go into the settings here, and we can actually change the search that is running. So each one of these widgets is essentially a LogPoint search, which is running each minute. So here's the search syntax. We could change the data that it's running against, and we could change the time frame. And we can also change the presentation of the data. So these are the various different types of presentation methods which are available for this data. So basically, some of these other tabs here. So these are all tabs which ship with LogPoint. So LogPoint has gone to great effort in order to create and curate a large collection of content which is available. So really, the task of creating dashboards within LogPoint is really one of selecting from content that has already been created. Obviously, here's a dashboard that might be used within a SOC environment. Here's another example of a dashboard that's presenting data that came from Nessus vulnerability scanner. And you'll see that there are various types of ways we can visualize this data. And really, the goal of LogPoint is twofold. One is to make the task of creating dashboards easy by having pre-built dashboards already created, which can then be customized. And secondly, it's also to have a large collection of different display methods for looking at that data. And so these are some other examples of ways that you can view this data. So if you actually wanted to add a new dashboard tab, you could click on this plus sign here, And you could either create a dashboard tab from scratch, which would essentially be a blank canvas, or you can select from a number of vendor dashboards. So as I mentioned, vendor dashboards are essentially the pre-built content that LogPoint distributes with the product. They tend to be organized around different security technologies and different security and compliance frameworks. So you'll see some dashboards related to things, technologies such as Office 365, as well as security frameworks like SANS, for example. And I think at the current time that there's over 500 different dashboards that ship with LogPoint. So one other thing I want to point out with dashboards. So the dashboards are also interactive. So you can actually interact with these dashboards. So if we wanted to understand what is the data related to this graph, we can actually click on it. And from here, we're given the option of drilling into this. So if we wanted to actually view the logs, we can view them in a new window here. And so by doing so, we are now looking at we're now brought into LogPoint's search interface. So LogPoint's search interface allows you to interact directly with the LogPoint data. Here at the top, we can see the search string that was being used by that dashboard widget. And we can see here the data against which it was run. So this is a list of all the different repositories on the system. By not selecting any, that means we're searching against all of them. And here we can select the time frame. So right now we have an inherited time frame that came from that dashboard, but if we wanted to change that to any one of these options, we could as well. This along the top here, this represents a time chart of when the logs that match this search string occurred. You can also use this as a method to kind of drill in and further focus your attention on particular logs. And right here, we actually have the logs themselves. So these are actually, there's alternating rows of gray and white. And so basically each row represents a different log. In the bottom here, we've got the raw logs. And above it, we have the normalized log. So the normalized log, obviously, LogPoint is taking in the raw log. And from that, it's building a list of keys and values, or key value pairs, essentially, representing that log data, putting this into essentially a structured data format. In this interesting fields box here, so this actually helps us to understand what are the different values for each of these different fields within here. So if we wanted to see what all the various actions are without having to look through this, we could actually click on here and we can see that that this 100% of these are related to permitted. We could see the domains as well. So the interesting fields provide you an easy way to kind of look through the data without actually having to look through it. So all of the elements within this search area are all clickable, and by clicking on this, we could actually further refine the search. So if we wanted to limit the search to this URL, by clicking on that, you'll notice that it's actually added this URL to the search string, and so it's further refined our count of logs from 10 down to 9. And by the same token, you could also use these as a method by which you could further refine your search. So I'll just take 2 minutes to give you an example of how you could build a search from scratch. So taking the use case of data exfiltration, if we wanted to understand what type of Dropbox activity we had in our environment, we could write a simple query that said application equals Dropbox. And we could say that we want to run that against the firewall logs. And we want to look at the last 6 hours. And so by running that now, we can see that we have 577 logs that match that. And LogPoint will now actually will highlight Dropbox here. So we see all instances of application equals Dropbox. We can take these results. So now if we want to understand who the users of Dropbox were, we could actually look here within the interesting fields, and we could click on user, and we could see a list of the users themselves. And this is very helpful. If we actually wanted to let's say that we actually wanted to potentially have this information presented on a dashboard, we could actually modify this query. So we could actually take these results, we could pipe them to the chart function. We could chart the sum of the data size by user. And now we have a, now we're basically aggregating on user, and we're summing up the data size for each user in bytes. And so we can, we have an understanding of how many bytes each user transferred. We could further refine this. So let's say we wanted to have this in megabytes instead of bytes, we could divide by 1024 twice, and we could actually rename the field. And so now we have it in megabytes transferred. We could order by megabytes transferred. We could do that in descending order. And we could limit it to, let's say, the top 5. So now we have a list of the top 5 users of Dropbox. So hopefully this demonstrates, how easy it is to build a search, and with that search to manipulate the results into some way of presenting that data. Now, with this information, you could take this and put it onto the dashboard. In which case you would simply provide a name for the dashboard, and then you would tell LogPoint onto which dashboard you would like to place this widget. Another option that could be useful, so you might actually take this information and want to make an alert out of it, and so you want to be alerted every time someone goes to Dropbox. In which case you could actually add this search to an alert rule. And by the same token, you could build an alert rule to do that. So with that, I wanted to just take a minute to talk a little bit about alert rules. So LogPoint, much like dashboards, LogPoint has attempted to make creating alert rules very easy, and in doing so, LogPoint has created a very large collection of predefined rules. So if we look in our alert rule section, we look at the vendor rule section, we can see that there are 677 vendor rules that come pre-configured with LogPoint out of the box. And so these are all various types of alert rules that you could enable, depending on which of these are relevant to your environment and your security program. And I also want to point out that as with the most recent LogPoint release, most of these alert rules are now mapped into the MITRE ATT&CK framework. So you can see exactly which area within the attack framework each rule corresponds to. And this, again, can help you to understand where you have coverage in your environment with respect to the MITRE ATT&CK framework, where potentially you may have some gaps in coverage. And it can also help you to understand, given seeing one particular type of alert, what is the next possible or probable place where an attacker might go based on kind of known behaviors of these attackers. So for each one of these alert rules, you can now define basically automated response and notification rules for each of these. So given a particular alert rule firing, you can say, I want to be notified. I want to be notified that by way of email, syslog, or SNMP, for example. And within these alerts, you can specify exactly what information is presented and in what manner is presented. LogPoint can also act as a trigger for automated responses, and so that could be LogPoint actually interacting with an API and passing a parameter to it. Potentially, for example, interacting with your firewall and passing an IP address to it that the firewall should black hole, or it could be interacting with something like a SOAR tool such as Demisto or Swimlane or Inkman. And so some of the options for that, obviously we have right here, we have an Inkman notification. As I mentioned, we also integrate with Swimlane and Demisto. And more generically, we could in theory integrate with any type of SOAR tool, because we do have the ability to interact with APIs and to script and to use custom scripts. An HTTP notification is a way that you can interact with a RESTful API. So you could specify a URL and the parameters that are passed to that URL. And an SSH notification at the most basic level allows LogPoint to log into an SSH server and to run a script. So at a very generic level, you can you can basically, you can automate a response with a simple script. So once these alert rules are fired, they will notify you in whatever manner you've specified. They will also create an incident within LogPoint. So the LogPoint incident management workflow here allows users to work and collaborate with incidents with team members. And so this is not something that's intended to necessarily replace some system that you already have if you already have an incident management platform. However, if you do not, then LogPoint does provide this interface, and it will allow you to search for various types of incidents based on their name, when they occurred, whether they're assigned to you or to somebody else, what their criticality is, what their status is. And then for each of these incidents, for example, you can actually, you can supply, you can apply comments, so you can actually interact with your teammates related to an incident. You can see what data has been collected related to this incident. You can actually go back into the raw data if you want to do more investigation. And you can also, you can take ownership of an incident, or you can actually assign it to one of your team members. So LogPoint also includes a full-featured reporting engine built into the solution. Once again, much like other content within LogPoint, like dashboards and alert rules, LogPoint has pre-built many commonly used report templates, and these report templates typically revolve around various security vendors, as well as various types of compliance standards as well. So, looking at some of the vendor report templates, we can see some related to NERC SIP, Office 365, really a large collection. We've got over 168 pre-built report templates. And these report templates can all be, they can be cloned and used. They can be customized. So if you wanted to customize a report template, you can actually open it up. And the structure of a report template is essentially just a series of LogPoint searches. So each one of these rows within this report template is a LogPoint search, and the icon on the left tells you a little bit about how that data will be presented. If we wanted to add an additional, additional search to this report, we could select a query right here. We'll be presented with some options. In this case, we'll select one of the query that we just did for Dropbox. We can pick how we want to display that data, whether it's in a chart or tabular format. Give the header, the panel header name. Click OK. OK again, and now we've got our new element, which has been added to this report template. We can now customize the position of that element within the report, and this is kind of like the the basic way of doing it. But if you wanted to get very fine-grained in terms of your the format of the report, you could go to personalize. And here we can see that all the elements within this report are essentially single column elements which take up the entire width of the page. If you wanted to actually add some more different types of layouts for your pages, for example, if you wanted to have two panels, you could add that element. Now we have two empty panels here, and we could pick what queries we wanted to go in that. And so basically, it's very customizable. So we can actually add our Dropbox query here. Now that's going to show up in this one panel here. So that's how you can create a report template. With report templates, you can then customize whether you want to run them on a particular schedule, hourly, daily, weekly, or monthly. You can customize at what time of the day they will run and during what time zone. You can customize against which data they will run. And you can also customize what the output of the report should be, whether it's PDF, HTML, Excel, or Word doc. Additionally, reports can be emailed directly to recipients. And when reports are completed, they will arrive in the inbox. And if we take a look at Himalayan Buzzard, we can see, so this is an example of a fictitious company called Himalayan Buzzard. The purpose of this is to show that you can actually customize the watermarks and graphics that are displayed. And so this is what a report can look like. It can have optionally can have a table of contents, and then you can have different types of data being presented here in different formats. So with that, I want to take the next few minutes to talk a little bit about LogPoint's UEBA, and then I will wrap things up and see if there are any questions. So as I mentioned earlier in the presentation, LogPoint UEBA is a complementary product to the LogPoint Core SIEM. And LogPoint UEBA is actually takes data from the SIEM and runs it through machine learning algorithms, which can look for certain types of threats, which are difficult to detect using rule-based approaches. The UEBA actually runs in the cloud, so basically the data that is transported up to the cloud is encrypted at all times, and it doesn't represent all log data. It's basically just a subset of that log data. So just key value pair combinations which are required to run these machine learning algorithms. The data that the UEBA then processes is returned back to LogPoint and presented through a dashboard. And so if we look here at the UEBA dashboard, we can see that the UEBA has analyzed approximately 114 million log events, from which it is determined that almost 2,600 of them have been determined to be anomalous in some manner. And from that, we have 3 what appears to be risky entities. And again, entities refers to users, websites, servers, or shares. Basically, things that could be modeled. Things that essentially have an IP address or a username for which the behavior can be modeled. The bottom part of this dashboard shows us the overall threat index over time. So we can see here that the organization's threat level is rising, and it has a score of 81. Those scores will always be between 0 and 100. And the color coding here tells us a little bit about the fact that one of the greatest contributors to this risk factor is potential lateral movement, which has been detected within the environment. If we wanted to dig a little bit deeper into what exactly has been detected as far as anomalies and what are these risky entities, we can click on the Explore tab. This will allow us to specify the time frame against which we are looking. So we can say we want to look at all data. And now we have essentially a timeline of the various anomalies and when they occurred. So the gray boxes toward the bottom, these are essentially low risk anomalies. And as we move up the spectrum, we've got yellow, orange, and ultimately red. These represent increasingly risky anomalies. If we wanted to, filter on just the riskier ones, we could actually apply this. We could adjust this threshold, and so now we're just looking at the higher risk ones. By doing so, you'll notice that we've also refocused what's contained in these boxes as well. So here's a list of top risky users. As I mentioned, the risk scores are between 0 and 100. And essentially what LogPoint UEBA is doing is it's assigning a risk score to each user and entity based on the number of times and the severity with which they are associated with anomalies. So for example, Joshua Newman has the highest risk score of 87. And really what that means is that Josh has been associated with multiple anomalies, and most likely that those anomalies were had higher severity, which each factor contributes to Josh's score being raised. Now we're looking at risky users. We could also look at other entity types as well, such as risky websites. But for the purposes of this conversation, let's focus on users. And so the final thing I want to point out is we also have in this panel here. So this is actually the list of anomalies that are represented here as well. So once again, if we wanted to, let's say we just want to focus on Joshua Newman and see exactly what Joshua Newman has done, which has resulted in him having a score of 87. We can click on Josh Newman. That's going to refocus this to just the anomalies that Josh is associated with. We can also click on extreme risk, and this will refocus it again to just be those high severity risks. And now we can start to dig in a little bit deeper into these anomalies. we can see that what this one is telling us is that Joshua Newman worked in this hour, which was very unusual based on past activity. So what we're seeing here is that Joshua's typical behavior or typical working hours are, tend to cluster here in the afternoons. And Joshua was actually observed working in the morning. It looks like about 8 o'clock. And so I think this provides a good example as to why a behavioral-based approach is more effective than a rule-based approach might be. And simply because, the fact is that Joshua, if you were to try to model something in the core SIEM to alert you when users work outside of their normal hours, then you would have to basically say, well, what are normal hours? And that really depends, that can be highly dependent on companies that operate in different geographies and have, different time zones to deal with. And it can also be highly dependent on, companies that have shift work or companies that simply allow their users, the freedom to work whenever they want. So being able to model this on a per user basis allows LogPoint to provide very, accurate, very high fidelity alerts related to a particular user's activity. Now, this anomaly by itself, may or may not be something that you would want to be alerted to. However, we also noticed that within the same time frame, Joshua has another anomaly related to him. And in this case, Joshua was observed sending 1.31 gigabytes within an hour. And this is significantly larger than Josh would typically send. Typically, he wouldn't be expected to send more than, he typically would transfer about 820 kilobytes of data. Wouldn't be expected to send any more than 29 megabytes, but clearly this was much more than normal. So this constitutes a probably significant anomaly, and furthermore, we're not only considering what Joshua's actual behavior is himself, but we're also considering what are the behaviors of Joshua's peers. How much data do they typically transfer, and is that anomalous for them as well? The reason why this is important is because, basically there's a first time for everything. So, every behavior happens for the first time, at one point. So being able to compare, this to not only that particular user's own behavior, but also to his peers allows you to, again, have higher fidelity alerts to reduce the chance of false positives and false negatives, because, what's new for Joshua Newman might be very common for some of his peers. So once again, this is a way that LogPoint can actually add higher fidelity and reduce the chance of false positives. So with that, as I mentioned, these anomalies by themselves may not be worthy of your attention. However, when looking at them as a group and in series, they could be indicative of some type of nefarious activity that's related to Joshua Newman. And so really the goal of the UEBA is to bring your attention to those types of threats that maybe you didn't think to look for, or that that you weren't looking for. And furthermore, these anomalies are good by themselves in terms of alerting you to things like data exfiltration. However, you can actually increase the fidelity of your other rule-based alerts within the core SIEM with UEBA as well, because now you have a risk score associated with each user. So if we think back to the use case that I described earlier, where we had a search that looked for Dropbox activity, maybe it's not against acceptable use. Maybe you do want to allow your users to use Dropbox. However, maybe you want to be alerted if a user with a high risk score accesses Dropbox, because that could be indicative of someone potentially exfiltrating data. So once again, these risk scores are not only useful within the context of these types of machine learning algorithms and these types of behavioral based threat types. They're also useful in terms of adding fidelity to all of the other alerts you have within your system. And so with that, that concludes what I had planned to speak about with respect to LogPoint, UEBA, and Core SIEM. At this point, I'm going to take a look at the Q&A and see if there are other questions to be answered. So the first question I have is, how is the product priced? So the LogPoint Core SIEM is actually priced based on the number of log sources. So basically, for each device that has an IP and produces logs, that's considered one device. And so LogPoint is licensed based on device. So what that means is that you're not going to pay any more for devices that produce a lot of logs. It's just based on the number of logs, the log sources. It also means it's predictable. So if your cost 1 year is for, let's say, 100 devices, and the next year you still have that same 100 devices, your cost will be roughly the same as it was the previous year. It will not potentially go up if you resulted in more log volume than you expected. And the second component is UBA. So the UBA is actually licensed based on the number of users and entities that you want to model the behavior on. So if you want to look at 1,000 users and 100 servers, then you would have licensed UBA for 1,100 entities, essentially. It says, the next question, UI is kind of similar to Elasticsearch. Are you using Elasticsearch as a search engine? So the answer is no, we're not using Elasticsearch. However, LogPoint is based on Apache Lucene. And my understanding is that Elasticsearch is also based on a version of Apache Lucene. So they do share some similarities under the hood in terms of the indexing and search engine. However, LogPoint is not based on Elastic. So at this point, I would like to thank everyone for taking the time to learn about LogPoint. I certainly appreciated having the opportunity to speak to you about LogPoint. I believe everyone here probably has my contact information. If you don't, it's actually jmc@logpoint.com. And if you do have questions following this session and you want to reach out, please feel free to do so. And once again, thank you everyone for taking the time to hear about LogPoint. Take care.